Hi, I'm Dean Shresky, and I have the privilege of working with almost 300 high school leaders across the Metro Vancouver, British Columbia area over the past 6 months, 7 months, and culminating with this final white paper that we've called the PandemicShifts Considerations for British Columbia Secondary Schools. And while certainly it was focused on British Columbia high schools, we believe and we know that the ideas shared in here have far, far broader implications to schools all around the world. And so we're excited to celebrate this with you. And what you're going to view just after my brief introduction is a webinar in which the participants and the leaders from this work are sharing their findings to a larger group. So just a little bit of context. Most people know that Finland has been revered around the world as having probably the world's best education system, and it's hard to disagree with that. Interestingly enough, Pasi Sahlberg of Finland himself has talked about Canada as perhaps being the next Finland. And again, depending on what measures you find important, whether they're P's or others, it's true, and I can speak from experience that British Columbia remains top-notch in the way that they view education, and particularly, as you see in that last statement, the value that they place on equity. So lots of great things happening in British Columbia. I've had the privilege of working with school districts and states across the US and Canada over the past year, and I continually reference British Columbia as having some of the best curriculum, some of the best teachers, and some of the best cultures, where no matter where you go around the world. The New York Times recently wrote an article making schools more human and referencing the British Columbia curriculum specifically as a curriculum that focuses on the big ideas and doesn't get bogged down in any kind of minutia or less important ideas than those sort of essential ideas. And certainly in the past year plus, people have been thinking about what the pandemic means and how we must think about it differently. And I like the quote in this article that talks about a willingness to be disturbed. And that really speaks to a strong culture in British Columbia and amongst these leaders that they are willing to check themselves in terms of how might we get better. And as well as they do in a lot of metrics, they still see a need to continuously think about getting better, specifically around hybrid learning. We know this is here to stay. And so what is that going to mean for those schools and education in general moving forward? There's a lot of great resources out there that we sort of relied on. Restarting and Reinventing School is a really great document put together by Linda Hammond-Darling and others, looking at top priorities for the future of schools and many other things that COVID has made us think about moving forward. So this group actually began way back in June of 2020 and started the conversation about what they were seeing early on, and it evolved over the next several months, culminating with a smaller subset of a larger forums conversation that wanted to delve into some very, very specific aspects and try to pull out some research and practice that was happening in order to produce some key recommendations and ideas. And so that's what this working group did. From January to April, they worked, they analyzed the data, they collected it, and this was our outcome. You see there's sort of the broad demographics of the larger group that came together, and again, this final group that actually produced this document that I helped facilitate and co-write is in and around the 40 mark, but it represents a very, very broad spectrum of leaders across the Metro Vancouver area, which is approximately a population of around 3 to 4 million people. So the rest of this video, you'll see the 10-minute or so reports from the individual 4 groups that are shared, that shared their findings and key takeaways. And so we know that this is a really, really important conversation. We're grateful that we are able to share this with you, and we hope that you find this valuable as well.
Forward in terms of how we use that time creatively and how kids jumped in and used that time well. So we're all playing in that area of flexible instructional time. And I think I'm kicking it over to Jeanette now. There we go.
Thank you, Ian. So the schools and the districts that were part of our working group really spent some time in November and December and even January, February, in gathering feedback from all of our stakeholder groups, including our parents, students, staff, as well as our partner groups. And what was interesting is, although we all asked different questions in our surveys, or we did them in different ways, whether it was through forums or thought exchange or even student forums, we did find some commonalities in some of the feedback that we gained. And those have been listed here. Focusing on 2 courses in a quarter is easier to manage and focus. And certainly that was a comment made by students, particularly in a pandemic. They found it to be very helpful to just have to focus on 2 courses in a quarter. Longer classes in the quarter system, some found it to be beneficial. Others found it to be somewhat challenging. Hybrid classes was greatly appreciated because in essence, it enabled us to continue to provide that student choice in elective courses. Flex time and flexible student support time, and Ian talked a little bit about that, just in the fact that it really helps support students with their learning. This was particularly helpful when we're looking at the quarter system and where traditionally some schools may have been semestered or linear, and it was easier in that kind of a system to offer English language learning support or learning support for students with diverse abilities or needs. This flexible student support time or flex time enabled schools to provide that support more year round. Blended and hybrid learning was preferable for some students. It really worked well.
Jeanette, we lost your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so then blended hybrid classes were not necessarily viewed to be as effective as in-person classes from the feedback we received. There were some key takeaways that came out of the feedback that we gathered as well. For some students, that condensed schedule quarter system was very challenging, particularly if they had 2 very challenging courses in that quarter, and if their courses weren't necessarily balanced throughout the entire school year. Students missed out on that gradual building of skills because the courses were 10 weeks long. If students were absent for an extended period of time, they did fall behind more easily. And another concern was the fact that if a student had math, let's say in the first quarter of one year, if we were to continue the quarter system next year, they might in essence get math at the end of that quarter and that second year. So there's concerns in terms of gaps of time between courses. And then finally, a highlight was the fact that prep time was a concern for some in the quarter system because for some schools or districts, the prep time would have been scheduled just for that one particular quarter. When planning for the 2021-22 school year, certainly a lot of that feedback was taken under consideration and part of our discussion in our groups. We know that there is an anticipation that we're back in stage 1 for September, this coming up September. Of course, we know there's a lot of uncertainties around COVID still, and so we need to be able to pivot between the stages should they change. And so when we look at that transition from stage 2 that we're in right now and hopefully a stage 1 in the fall, we need to keep the following in mind: ways to support our diverse learning needs. What's the best time to have that flex time, X block, or flexible student support time in the schedule? We all found that to be extremely valuable, but now let's talk about the placement of that. Is there a better place for those things to be in a student timetable? Collaboration time, I think, was certainly missed by some schools this year. So how do we incorporate that? How many classes do we put in the schedule? When we moved to a quarter system, many schools actually moved to 2 classes that were much longer during the day. So some of the feedback included what people's preference were. Was it 2 classes in the day or 4 classes? How do we schedule that linear prep time and offer linear courses as well? While we were discussing whether or not stage 1 would look like a quarter system or semester or linear system, the semester system is really strongly considered by school districts, and I know that some have even come out and said they are doing this semester system if we are in stage 1. Certainly a quarter system lends itself very nicely to a stage 2 because you're much more easily able to implement the learning groups. But having said that, even in a semester system, I know that schools are considering particular courses to still run as a linear system, whether they're being offered before school, after school, or during an X block, for example, or during the flexible student support time. Courses such as AIB, AP, learning support time, English language classes, those kinds of classes are being considered by schools and still being offered in a linear way. And finally, another driving factor, I think, for schools in their scheduling is also the incorporation of specialty programs, including academies and train and trades programs. And so Ian is going to talk about the first example of a semester schedule, and then I'll talk about a second one as well.
Yeah, just very quickly, this is where a lot of the creative thinking came along, and people are tackling the same problems and coming to different places. And I think, as Jeanette said, no matter what, we still have to be flexible. We really can't nail down what September will look like. So like happened last spring, all of this may be adjusted, and we're gonna go there. So this is just a sample semester timetable that West Van is considering. Again, it's not set in stone, we're just considering it. And it's a semester timetable that allows for 4 blocks on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then allows for 2 longer blocks on Tuesday and Thursday. And in West Van, we've kind of created an X block time where our academies fit in and vulnerable learners get their support. There's opportunities for students to connect with teachers. We've got probably a large percentage of our students are programmed during that X block time. So that's just a sample of what some school districts are playing with, or a concept very similar to that.
And then here's another example as well. I know that this is one being considered in Burnaby, and certainly we're just in the process of getting feedback from everyone on this, but similar idea in terms of having a couple of days where your periods 1 through 4 classes are longer. Certainly that is appreciated by courses such as woodworking, home ec, even in math. Some math teachers prefer having that longer period of time, but at the same time also providing the shorter periods as well on Monday, Tuesdays, and Fridays. Certainly continuing to have that flexible student support time, just a half hour first thing in the morning from Monday through Thursday, but having that extended flex, or some might call it an X block time, or student support time on Fridays of about 50 minutes, but then also giving the option for collaboration time in there as well for schools. So that's another example under consideration. And so certainly we were left with still many, many questions in our working group. Really what we are all, I know, looking at is what will the state of public health be at the end of September, or I should say at the end of August as we move into the fall. Will learning groups be required? Because I think that certainly is going to have us pivot most likely to the quarter system if they are. What impact does the schedule versus changes in pedagogy and assessment have on students' academics, attendance, and mental well-being? So when our districts or schools collected some data and we shared them with each other, you know, in some cases attendance improved in the first quarter, but maybe dropped off a little bit in the second quarter. Or maybe when you compared the quarter 1 course results on students' report cards with that in previous years, you might have found academics improved. What that is due to, it's really hard to tell. Is it because of the quarter system, or are there certainly other factors that we know are coming into play here during the pandemic? What impact does the pandemic have on people's experiences with the quarter system? Would the feedback we would have received be very different were we not in a pandemic? And what are the long-term impacts of the quarter system that we have implemented this year? And then finally, how do we ensure that we take the lessons that we've learned to inform our planning beyond the 2021-22 school year? So certainly right now we're looking ahead to next year. It'll be really interesting as everybody in our group continues to get feedback next year to inform our planning after, particularly from people who have likely experienced a linear semester system, a quarter system this year, and maybe even a semester system next year. To get their feedback will be particularly interesting. So I think what we really got the most from our group is just the ability to share ideas, to share our feedback and our data, to collaborate and come up with ideas for our planning in the future. And I know that we're all looking forward to continuing those connections in the upcoming year. All right, thank you. And I know that I think there'll be opportunities for questions at the end.
Thanks, Jeanette. And Ian, thanks for setting us off. And again, I think Jeanette sort of referenced the fact that one of the big takeaways is this ability that we now have to network, and for them to be able to shift in August to recollect data is not going to be difficult. So appreciate that opportunity. So there's definitely a nice segue to the next our next topic, which is blended learning. And that is a blended and hybrid. And so I'm going to invite Mr. Sean Nosek to share a little bit about their group's findings.
Well, thank you, Dean, and good morning, everybody. Nice to join you all virtually for a little bit this morning. I'm very pleased to be joining you from the lands of the Squamish Nation here in beautiful West Vancouver. I want to begin actually by giving a shout out to the amazing team I had a chance to work with on this topic of blended learning. It was kind of cool because we really had, we stretched quite literally from Chilliwack to the Sea to Sky region with representatives from West Vancouver, Vancouver, Chilliwack, Burnaby, Langley, Sea to Sky, and Richmond participating. So shout out to Allison Ogden, Vancouver, Ryan Fullerton, Vancouver, Paul Bernard, Chilliwack, Tim Wozni, Burnaby, Brandon Kerr, Burnaby, Meg D. Gabriel from Langley, Nolan Cox, Sea to Sky, and Lester Leung from Richmond. So really, really great and rich conversations that we had on this topic. Just going to give you kind of a flyover where we landed, so to speak. I think the reason this group stuck with this topic fundamentally was because we feel like there's still something very exciting and intriguing about the possibility of blending the best of what we do with face-to-face education and leveraging the power of digital tools and platforms to create something that can be profoundly rich and perhaps a more personalized learning experience for students. So how neat to be able to share stories, school level stories, district-based stories from 7 different school districts with a whole range of experiences between us, from experience in DL and running some blended programs. And what we found to a person really was that what we had done in terms of creating some blended learning opportunities as a COVID response really, at the end of the day, didn't resonate all that well when we solicited feedback from our students and from our educators. And that's not to say that there weren't some who were big fans. They absolutely were, but still didn't totally hit the mark. And yet, as we fleshed that out, we realized that our COVID response in terms of delivering and introducing a hybrid and blending really was around trying to make cohorts work, and wasn't done necessarily with the kind of thoughtfulness that we might do if we were building truly from scratch to try to create an exciting blended learning opportunity. So what I thought I would do with my few minutes, and I'm going to be really efficient with time here, is share with you ultimately the recommendations that this group arrived at after sort of a deep dive in fleshing out what it is that we had done in our schools and districts, what our survey results, what achievement data, what the anecdotal experiences were, what the student voice was, what the teacher voice was, and so on, and kind of putting it all together, wrestling it to the ground to try to come up with something, with the notion that what we would hate to see happen is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater and conclude that based on sort of survey feedback, blended learning doesn't work, or hybrid learning doesn't sit well with too many people. What we think is that there's a lot of learning that we've had the chance to do, and that we would go forward with some different thoughts. So with that in mind, and I'm not going to do a screen share with you, I'm just, we're having a conversation, and this is all in the document that you have access to and will have access to. So without further ado, one of the first recommendations that we have with respect to this is for folks to consider the broader implications and possibilities that blended learning options might offer with respect to how we do school now and in the future. So, it's easy to get carried away. Oh, we should do blended learning, or what are we doing for blended learning? But actually, back to basics. What is it that's possible here, and why might you want to get into this space? And whether you tiptoe in or you want to go in a little more broadly, why might you want to do that? We also arrived at a conclusion that blended, if offered, should be a choice, and best if it's a choice for students and for the staff who might be teaching it. In our conversations, many times we found that we actually put teachers in a position where they had to teach this way and students had to learn that way, and there wasn't really flexibility with respect to how it was actually structured and delivered. Have an underlying reason, a why. Why might you want to go into this space? Is it flexibility? Is it personalization? Is it learning style? Is it something else? And again, to be clear, we agreed that we do not want to dismiss blended learning options in the future as a result of the reactions to our COVID response, which may not have been optimal. A big one for us, that thoughtful design is absolutely paramount. So when you think about how you might actually schedule and structure face-to-face time and remote times, that opens a window to all kinds of possibility. Think about the size and frequency, for example, of your face-to-face time. It doesn't have to be everybody all at once. It doesn't have to be the half and half, but what's optimal? Personalization and differentiation should be major considerations. We felt that blended learning approach that used inquiry-based, project-based, or constructivist approach would be well received, generally speaking. Another thing that manifested was having clear expectations, particularly for the remote time. So it's one thing when you have your face-to-face and you sort of have your built-in captive audience, so to speak. But what are the actual expectations for that remote time? And is it a flipped model or not? And what works best with what subject and grade and all those sorts of things. It seems obvious perhaps to say, but consistent and capable school district supported digital platforms are absolutely vital. A piecemeal approach where this teacher's using this platform and the other one's using something different did not go over well. And so whether it's MS Teams or G Suite, and the fact that the district would actually endorse and support this is a recommendation that we have for sure. When you do anything that involves a digital space, you do want to make sure that you are upfront very mindful and thoughtful about security and privacy. And we know that during the times of COVID, there's been some relaxed rules around FIPA. And so that's been helpful, but certainly on a go forward basis, when you're thinking about the applications, the software, you do want to be very mindful and careful with respect to that. Don't go into the space without consulting your IT department and making sure that you've checked off all the boxes that you've got, whether it's as simple as bandwidth or devices or software or somebody that can help you troubleshoot when something goes wrong. Also very, very important. A big one for us, for sure, has to do with equity. And we came at this sort of from two ways, and that was, we want to make sure that this is not an exclusive opportunity. And so, access to technology is critical. and that no student that should be denied, obviously, an opportunity to engage in this sort of learning, and that the potential for something like this to be exclusive exists. On the flip side, though, we also realized that if you think about, in the high school principals and timetablers who are on the call here this morning will appreciate this, that every year you might make an elective offering and you might find, oh, I'm trying to run Spanish and French and Japanese, and it ends up that I've got 15 students in each, instead of having a nice number of 30. I've got 3 classes of 15 that I can't really run. But if the same dynamic was happening at some of your neighboring high schools, that you might be able to use a blended approach to actually be able to allow access where you might have said, look, we just can't run Spanish this year, and it's not an option for anyone. You actually can maybe increase access by thinking about leveraging the power of technology and blended learning. So sensitive to the issues of equity. The other recommendation for sure, and I think this was part of the richness of our group, to be honest, that ongoing PD and learning opportunities be made available to those teachers who are teaching blended. This is an emerging space. I don't know that there are real experts out there yet. There are likely some who purport to be, but I think the idea of groups engaged in this sort of work being able to share best practices and share the mistakes. I wouldn't do it this way again. I would structure it this way again. I prefer this tool, that sort of thing. And to actually be strategic about allowing for those kinds of opportunities. Again, blended learning teachers should seek to ensure they embed ways to include healthy social interaction. Sometimes when we engage like this in a digital space, it's easy to get nuts and bolts. That was some of the feedback we had for some of the blended learning during COVID, that it's a quarter and it's online and it's like, let's get down to work for sure. But we know that learning and school needs to have this social component. So how do you mindfully, thoughtfully embed that? You likely want to think about grade levels and ages and even particular subjects or courses. Are there some courses that are just better suited or that easier translate to this sort of dynamic? It might be harder to run an applied skill or ADST course, or perhaps not, depending on what it is. The idea of giving the blended teachers some ownership to be able to take some risks and develop a program, absolutely, to be able to come together and share successes, not only with other blended learning teachers, but with all teachers. Who knows what's in store in the future, but the technology side of it certainly isn't going away. The idea that we can access material and learning anywhere, anytime is here to stay. We got a little bit hung up and we didn't clean this up for you. I apologize, but that was on terminology, blended or hybrid. For today's purpose, we're talking more blended, but it's wise for you to get consistent with how you want to approach that. And a little bit of that had to do with the idea that a student might have one course that's blended, I'll say, but they may actually have a whole education program that could be hybrid, which is to say they're doing some that's strictly face-to-face and some that might be entirely remote, and you put them together and you say, well, that's hybrid. And so I don't want to take you down a confusing road there, but just for our purposes, we tended to use the term blended, but whatever you're doing, be careful, because are you referring to the specific delivery of one course? Or are you in fact referring to the overall way a student might access an educational program, where some of it might be 100% online and some of it might be 100% in person, and you might then call that a hybrid program. And the instructional design needs to support the learning. So think about your audience, as is good practice for all educators. And again, the idea of increasing opportunities and access, and at the end, that's kind of that's where we landed with respect to the recommendations. We have them in print for you in that document, And I might just sort of rewind as I finish off to where we really began, which at the end of the day, nobody felt like they had a wonderful example of having nailed blended learning. And yet all of us still feel like there is something here that we shouldn't let go of, that being able to take the best of the face-to-face, but maybe free that up where it's, every day, everyone with a bum in a seat, that this could happen in smaller groups and more fluid. And that, with the digital tools we have available today, there could be something magic there. And so I look forward to the ongoing conversations in this regard. And certainly those of you who are interested or might be thinking about running some courses in your schools next year like this, would love to hear, your challenges and successes. And if there's anybody that's interested in thinking about, that professional development side, even if it's just bringing the conversation together next year, I'd be very interested in participating in that. So that's all. And again, a shout out to my wonderful group that I had the opportunity to engage with. Thanks so much, everyone. And Dean, thank you as well.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Sean. What's also interesting here is that those first two topics are definitely ones that were much more heightened and in some respects newer discussions to have. These next two are not specifically new. However, the pandemic did impact them, and as a larger group decided that these were the topics, assessment and wellness were ones that we really still had that the pandemic did impact, and that we needed to look at them with some fresh eyes. So with that end, I'm going to invite George to share a little bit about their group's findings.
Thanks, Dean. So good morning, everyone. My name is George Kozlovic. I'm the District Principal of Instructional Services out here in beautiful Langley, and coming to you this morning from the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Matsqui, Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nation. So I am representing the assessment group, and I just like to start, as Sean did, by acknowledging the other members of the assessment group. I think they're on the call, and if they would like to turn their cameras on and show their face, that would be great, but you don't have to. But Lynn Archer, Assistant Superintendent of the Richmond School District, Jennifer Towers, Vice Principal at Rockridge Secondary in West Vancouver, and Liz Taylor, who's a District Administrator of Learning Services in Richmond School District. So we were a fairly small group, but an amazing group to work with and collaborate on this project with. Just awesome to get together with people who have a passion like I do for assessment and talk about moving assessment practices forward. So I just wanted to acknowledge them for all of their hard work and input, and really enjoyed working with them. So I'm going to share what we discovered. And like Sean, I don't have a PowerPoint. Basically, everything is in the document, but I'll kind of try and give you a bit of an overarching view. And as Dean said, assessment, a little different than scheduling and blended hybrid in the sense that, so we took a bit of a different approach in the way we produce this. But as everybody on the call knows, assessment and evaluation, I mean, it never ends. It's got a long history in the work that we've done. Teachers, administrators, districts, we're constantly working and talking about assessment and how do we improve our assessment practices in classrooms and schools. And then if we think about the secondary level that we're talking about, like traditionally, we also know that at secondary, the focus around assessment has really been around summative assessment, right? Tests, quizzes, assignments, projects, things that our group decided we like to call sort of tasks or task completion. And we know that that is still the way things are, even though, we have a recently redesigned curriculum that's really more built around competency based with a greater focus on formative assessment. So despite that, we still know that all of us are still struggling within our work to try and create that shift in terms of the way we assess at the secondary level. So when we started digging into how COVID and the pandemic impacted assessment last year, we saw two things. We actually saw that it presented a challenge around assessment, but we also saw that it actually presented a really neat opportunity when it came to assessment as well. So the challenge piece was that as we talked amongst ourselves and with the districts that we were able to connect with, the question teachers were challenged with was not only how do we teach remotely in a remote environment, but how do we assess in a remote environment? Because teachers soon realized they couldn't just rely on those traditional practices like tests and quizzes to gather that data that they use. And they couldn't just take that and turn it into numbers and come up with a percentage and arrive at where the students were at. And they actually needed to start to look at other ways to gather evidence of learning and then figure out, okay, how do I use that evidence to actually make a determination when it comes to assessment and student learning? And that was especially true in the fact when the focus was really just on that essential learning that we were focused on last year in the spring. So that was the challenge for teachers, but the opportunity that we discovered that it presented was we actually found that secondary teachers started asking, like, we need help. How do we do this? We don't know how to do this, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's actually opened up an opportunity to shift that practice about not only how do you gather authentic evidence in a remote environment, but then how does that translate when we are back into a more in-person environment, or even this year in a more hybrid environment, which some districts are in, as that's kind of continued. And then the second piece that teachers, that provides the opportunity, okay, now that we have that evidence, like how do we actually take that evidence and use our professional judgment to determine where students are at? And so it kind of opened the door because a lot of districts are already working on this. Many of us are already working around how do we shift to a more standards-based or competency-based form of assessment that is more focused on learning and that actually aligns better with our curriculum. And so we know that districts have already produced lots of these resources. And then last year when the pandemic hit, other districts started working really quickly to try and produce these resources to support teachers. The other thing, the opportunity that presented is it's timely. We all know that we are expecting a new draft reporting order, hopefully sometime this spring. And we're making this shift towards more proficiency-based assessment. So all of this kind of sort of hit at the sort of right time to present that opportunity in terms of what could this actually look like. So what our assessment group did is we started looking around and seeing what do different districts have in terms of assessment supports, both prior to and then during the pandemic and since the pandemic started. And what we quickly realized was that all districts were currently all on this assessment journey together towards a more authentic, formative-based assessment practices that we all know are better meet the needs of our students, right? Competency-based, standards-based, using growth language, growth mindset, using proficiency language as opposed to letter grades and numbers and percentages. So what our group actually tried to do is we tried to gather examples from a number of different districts, and we organized it in the form of different assessment categories to kind of break it out and provide that as a resource for other districts. And what we hoped is that this would be the start of a resource that other districts could use as they continue their work on assessment. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly pull the document up. And again, I know that not all of you have it, but most of you have it. Can they see it, Dean? Is that showing up there?
Yep.
Okay. And just so I can just quickly go through it, I'm not going to go through it all. A caveat for everybody, our group recognizes that we do not have examples from all districts represented here today. We know that other districts out there have other types of examples that are as good, if not better than the examples we have. We did tend to rely heavily more on our districts that we worked in because we had access to those. We did reach out to other districts. We did gather some of that information. So please, understand that our real hope is that this was simply a starting point, some place where districts could start. And I think the other piece, as Dean's mentioned and Sean mentioned, also an opportunity like how can we continue to grow this document? Can we add additional resources from other districts? Because as I said, we're all working on this together not together, but we're all working on it differently in our own districts. So how can we do this work together? Because we're all trying to do the same thing. And so, just as an example, the very first piece is the guiding principles of assessment. So we've provided examples from about 4 districts who have done some work on producing some guiding principles for their district, which is now guiding the work that they're doing across their entire district. So for a district that hasn't done that, it's a great starting point in terms of doing that work. I can give you an example from Langley. We relied heavily on Vancouver's and actually connected with Vancouver's when we did our process, and actually reached out to them in terms of how they actually did it, so that we could actually help us guide the way we did it as we move forward. And so again, I'm not going to go through the whole document, you've got it, but as you can see, we have different categories. So we've got some documents on planning for learning and assessment. We've got some examples of standard-based assessment and learning maps. And again, be very clear, the caveat is these are not meant to be perfect. They may not be right in any way, but we also know that all districts are working on these types of things and teachers are working on these types of things. So if they're a starting point for those districts that are just getting going, then that's what they're meant to be, but they're not meant to be, the answer to the best ones that are out there. We have some examples of formative assessment tools that districts are using around core competency, self-reflections. As we're moving to proficiency scales, we have some examples of different types of language that can be used with parents and students around proficiencies. So all these types of examples are there. And I guess if I can highlight 2 that are linked to the pandemic, kind of the key ones in our mind in terms of what we were looking for that arose out of the pandemic. It is that evidence of learning piece in terms of some examples of how districts can help teachers understand that we can collect evidence from much more than just the traditional tests and quizzes. So how can we use observations in classrooms and conversations with students and other types of things to gather authentic evidence of student learning and incorporate that into our assessment? And then the other piece is a couple examples of then how can we help teachers sort of make that shift to assessing around proficiencies and not just turning it into a 4-point scale, where 1, 2, 3, 4, and then adding it all up and just turning it into a percentage. So how can we actually take the evidence that we have and arrive at a real good professional judgment around the work we're doing? So those were kind of 2 of the sort of takeaways that are linked directly to the pandemic. And you also notice that we don't have a lot on reporting because we didn't really want the focus to be around reporting. We really wanted it to be around assessment. And so that's kind of why there's not a lot around reporting. And again, partly, as I said earlier, we're hoping some clarity around the reporting piece will come with the new reporting order that is coming from the ministry in the near future. So that's kind of what we did. I tried to do it because I did promise Dianne I would make sure I left some time for her at the end. And as I said, like we hope that all this is a starting point for districts to use as a resource, and hope that there's a way. And I guess our big question is, how do we continue amongst all the districts represented here to share the assessment work that's going on in all of our districts so that we can all benefit from the great work that's being done across the province. So that's it for us, Dean.
Thanks, George. And what I think is true is that that group in particular really represented the fact that I don't know that anybody has ever done that work where they've collected all of those resources around assessment throughout the metro area. So if there's one thing that group really showed, is that the power of collaboration and the fact that this is great work to even begin and build upon. Because as you're talking about assessment, there's, you want to know what's happening in those neighboring districts. So appreciate the work of that group. So finally, it's Dianne's turn, and I'm going to pass it over to her. And I promised her, even though we're kind of running a little bit late, that wasn't reason for her to have less time than the other groups just because she was last. So, but I know Dianne is got a tight schedule to share, and excited to have her share her group's findings on well.
Good morning. Thank you, Dean. Thank you. And my name is Dianne Nelson, Director of Instruction for West Vancouver Schools. And I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Squamish Nation. And I would also like to say that I'm very privileged to speak on behalf of this amazing Metro working group. We wanted to start by acknowledging and recognizing the impact of the pandemic on the overall health of it, very real and unprecedented. To begin, the topic of adult well-being in education is not new. It has always been important, with over a decade of work being done in school districts across the province. This all started, as you can probably all remember, with CASTLE, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. This has become our trusted source of reference for our K-12 students around the province because of the evidence-based social and emotional supports that we have come to use and have found to be very effective in our schools and in our classrooms. And so if you fast forward to 2015, CASTLE actually provided supports for adult social and emotional learning competencies because of the many benefits that we know happen there, but one in our purposes for what we've done in this project is the reduction of teacher stress levels. So even today, we continue to focus on self-regulation because we know how important it is to be able to manage our emotions in order to do the things that need to get done in this optimal state that we want to be in to face anything that comes our way. And the final example I'm going to give historically around the province and all this great work, and this is it's going to make sense as I move forward, is that there was the practice of mindfulness that organically became a promising approach in school districts in order to support self-awareness, self-management, and overall stress management. So with that background, this group came together in this collaborative project to delve deeper into the topic of adult well-being. Specifically, because of the short time frame that we had, we decided to target teachers at the secondary school level. Now, the main objective was to gain an awareness of what strategies or habits teachers identify to manage stressors, those irritants, those interruptions, or unexpected events in their work environment. So to come up with an extensive list of strategies that impact overall well-being, what we did is we looked at all the research in this area that we could, coming up with a series of guiding questions, which you'll see in the document there, which then helped us develop a survey. And that what we tried to do was ensure that this survey was easy for teachers to complete and only take a few minutes. Now, within this survey, what we decided to do is come up with key categories, and that came from the research of those guiding questions. And we wanted teachers to focus their attention on these categories, thinking about and identifying those strategies that they perceived supported them positively during this pandemic. So here are the 6: a healthy mindset, a new normal, optimism, openness, physical and mental breaks, connectedness. Now, once we had the 6 categories, we went back to the growing research base that exists on self-care, and we identified several effective strategies that would fall under each of these key categories. So the idea was that in this survey, teachers would simply go to that category and there would be a drop-down menu and they would select 1, 2, or all of them if they were the ones that supported them through the pandemic in that particular category. So I'm going to give you an example. So I'd like us to have some fun. It's going to be the new normal. I'm going to list 5 effective strategies that, according to the research, work for facing a new normal. Think to yourselves which 1 or 2 or all you've been using to support yourselves. Practicing self-awareness, remaining consistently calm, sustaining focus, being aware of the stories you are telling yourself inside your head, reminding yourself that emotions, like the virus, can be contagious, both positively and negatively. So in addition, at the end of this survey, we asked teachers, because we got that information where they selected all these positive strategies, But at the end of it, we also wanted to find out which of those 6 would they like to learn more about, because that would provide us with a little bit of direction on future planning around what we could focus on in our individual schools. And lastly, at the end of the survey, what we also wanted to put in there was a chance to have one open-ended question that read, please add anything you would like us to know, strategies, ideas, tips that we could share with others. And let me tell you, it was the complete gamut from, you know, those that are saying, you know what, this survey is actually causing me stress, to I would really like everyone to know how well this is working. So it was just fascinating. So we had 100 teachers, grades 8 to 12, complete the survey in the following school districts: Richmond, North Vancouver, and West Vancouver. Now, while we feel we had a very good representative sample of teachers with a variety of grade levels and subject areas, if we'd had more time, we would have surveyed all the adults in the buildings rather than just the teachers, and we would have enjoyed getting out to more school districts and school sites. So that was a bit of a downside. But nevertheless, here's the thing. We all had our hunches about what we thought the results would, what would happen with the results. And not only were these hunches validated, but we also had some additional positive surprises. For example, teachers want to continue to develop healthy mindsets. Teachers have been engaging in physical and mental breaks, not only for themselves, but they're suddenly realizing, you know, maybe more so. It's not that they didn't know, but they're really engaging their students in both these kinds of movement and mental breaks. Teachers have really, and Dean has alluded to this, rediscovered the outdoors, and they are intentionally being in tune with the physical world. And finally, it is without question that teachers overwhelmingly reported missing the ongoing in-person social connections that occurred prior to the pandemic. So they became very innovative to find creative ways to maintain a sense of connectedness. What was very validating, and what we all know, is that our teachers are fiercely committed to the students despite this pandemic. So they're going to do all they can to connect. And overwhelmingly, teachers reported that what made the most impact in stress reduction were strategies that targeted their sense of belonging, their sense of team, and their sense of connectedness. So just to end my presentation, I just want to bring up a few slides about our learnings and our recommendations. Going here. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about was that what we learned through this whole process was fascinating. And again, I want to really indicate that this is not new. I know all of us know this, but it was just really validating to know this particular piece. And that you see on this slide that you've got the individual responsibility, you've got collaborative, you know, the people in our buildings, they have to take some action, and then there's the systemic actions. And what we found in the research was that you need to have strength in all 3 of these components, but on their own, it's not enough. So I'm just going to show you just touch on each of these components. So the reason we started with the whole notion of all the amazing work that's been done in this province in the social emotional learning realm is paying off, because in this individual action component on the left-hand side there, you see the traditional things that we have all promoted and engaged and tried to ensure that our teachers or our adults are doing. Regular exercise, eating well, getting sleep, taking mental breaks, and then that whole decade of social emotional learning is on the left-hand side. And I think we do a really good job. And my point and our point here is that, you know, at the end of the day, well-being lies within the individual. They have a responsibility to take care of themselves. But, and I think they're doing a great job, that's what we're finding through this survey, but on its own, it is not enough. So the second one is that we are all in unique contexts and cultures and conditions. That's always going to be, but what we all have in common are the relationships. And so we know that if teachers are not well, they cannot be at their best to support their students. And important learning is that well-being lies with the, what we know is that unless they're working together, they're not going to be able to build these relationships. And so on this slide, what I'm trying to portray is that we need to ensure that, or continue to ensure that all adults feel a sense of connectedness and engage in collaborative and meaningful conversation, because this, at the end of the day, is what infuses that positive emotional energy. And so again, on the slide, it's all about, and there's a lot of work around compassion right now. One of the things that our group found in the results was, it's not that they weren't compassionate before, but it really came to the surface where they were not only compassionate for themselves, but for certainly for others, you know, that whole kindness piece. And then finally, as we all know, at the end of the day, there is no change without system-wide change. So as you go through this journey to adult well-being, it is important to what we call connect the dots. And when you slowly and intentionally embed these key strategies through the system, it will eventually lead to this new way of being. And I've got this kind of busy slide here because I wanted to highlight these graphics on the left-hand side that do show that there is a lot of work that's going on in this whole area of wellness. And a graphic really has grounded the work in school districts and schools. They've developed them themselves, or they've used pieces from other graphics just to make it their own. And it's been powerful for keeping them on track. And the idea is that we want it to come from all angles. So my last slide here is a busy one, but I just wanted to quickly highlight those things that we already know, but were validated through our work in this project. Obviously, we need to have a vision and a purpose for sure, and there's a big one now, and it's been heightened through this pandemic. But the intentionality around why, and it's been mentioned by others in this project in the groups, is that you need to continue to. There's lots of reasons why, but to continue to bring that up and communicate it at every opportunity. We need to make sure everybody's on the same page, speaking the same language, so ensuring that everybody gets that communication about what it is we're trying to do at all levels. And then you'll see there the awareness of these three interconnecting components, that all three need to be strong, but that they do interconnect. And then, of course, here we mentioned our survey. That's one way, but definitely capturing the perceptions of the adults in your buildings, in your organizations is key. And then putting it all together. We found that everybody had some kind of a working group, a team, a committee, a collective group of stakeholders where they had a lead. Now, what's interesting about the lead is that you will find that they have particular skills, and they need to, in order to eventually not only move the work forward in buildings and in organizations, but to be those conduits to connecting the dots throughout the system. And finally, the last piece is about really embedding it into the work that you already do, strategically and intentionally, including a range of personal choices and ideas to create a system-wide approach. So it's not perceived as top-down, but you're sort of coming at it at all angles. How can you weave in this wellness? An example, I give is that, in a meeting, suddenly the why is we're going to get up and move for 5 minutes, and then we're going to continue our work, and why that's beneficial, that sort of thing. And my final point is that the absolute game changer are the actions of the superintendent, a key to influencing, role modeling, and ensuring alignment throughout the system. So for all you superintendents out there that are listening, no pressure. Okay, and that's kind of the end of the presentation. I just want to have my last slide. I just want to acknowledge this Wellness Metro group, Aviva Vaughn, Hugh McRoberts. These are all vice principals, amazing people. Nick Nashland from Cambie there, Adrian Goulas, McMath Secondary, Megan Downey from Sutherland Secondary in North Vancouver, Herge Gog from McNeil Secondary. And the other shout out I'm going to give is to Gail Markin from Langley as well. We just really appreciate everything that people have done to help us with this. We've enjoyed it. And the only thing I'm going to end with is that what you don't hear us say is the how. We haven't got to all those innovative and creative ways and activities and strategies within schools that move this work forward, but perhaps that's for another time. So thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you, George, Sean, Ian, and Jeanette for sharing that again, and all of the people behind the scenes that were acknowledged as well, who did such great work here. We are a little bit over time, and that's fine. I know some people have had to drop, and that's perfectly acceptable. But at the same time, we wanted to make some space for those that had a question or a comment about this. And so let's just, for those that are able to or interested in that, let us know. There was some conversation in the chat, a few questions, and some of a little bit of back and forth there. But we do want to make sure that people have a chance to ask any questions, whether it's specifically to a group or the project at large or paper at large or whatever you want. So do folks have questions they wanted to share at this time?
Dean, it's Alison Ogden
Yes,
from
Alison.
Vancouver. Hi. I was just picking up on it's been great to hear all of the work that everyone has done. So thank you. Huge to come together like this. What it gets me thinking about though, as we move into next year, the professional development and I guess to the point of the wellness and the connection. I think I'm interested if anyone's would be interested in having further discussions around those professional development opportunities and how we could potentially do those within the Metro District to connect teachers. Like I think there's a lot of learning that folks could share between districts, and I would be very much interested in participating in that conversation.
Well, I would just say that one of the, again, and I touched on it at the very beginning, that one of the sort of, I don't know if it's a side benefit or an actually direct benefit of what this larger group has done is that we've made some important connections. And so the document can perhaps serve as a conduit to do those, because I think, Alison, you're right, and Diane mentioned at the end that no, we haven't got to all the hows, and this was never intended to be here's a completed document and go forth and do amazing things. We hoped it would start conversations. So I think what you're speaking to, Alison, is what I would suggest is a really powerful next step that would suggest people reaching out to, and I see Gail's on the call as well, who's done some great work in her district, and so those contacts are there, those human resources are there. And what a powerful thing to get together to, and I get the sense that this group is more than willing to do those kind of things and put together something that isn't necessarily district specific, but is for the larger. So I mean, I'm speaking perhaps out of turn, but I think what you're suggesting, Alison, is spot on in terms of what the next step for this group, a larger group, could be. So Jeanette or Ian or team scheduling, Rick's got a question there. I don't know if any. I think Ian kind of mentioned in the chat some things around his willingness to support, but
yeah, I think I'd love to keep a little, I know Jeanette would too. And again, I just want to take a moment. Although I put people's names up on the slide, again, I didn't officially thank all those members of the Metro scheduling group. So they were totally a major part of this presentation. So thank you. Yeah, so I'd be happy to keep our Metro timetable group going, schedule group going. Maybe if you're interested and you want to pop me an email to those conversations, then I can piggyback that and just send me an email. I'll add you to a group and we'll set up some meetings, set up like we did last spring, if that works for people. I'm getting some private responses, so I'll just keep on the chat. So if you're in, just privately, actually, if you're in, just send me an email. That way I'll have an official list. I don't want to lose the stream. So thank you.
Well, and again, this is perhaps the most urgent of all of the topics that we explored is the scheduling, and this is top of mind for so many people. And so please, I think Ian and Jeanette set themselves up to say that they're very, very much willing to continue this conversation in more specifics. So that's great. But again, all of these different areas I thought had their own unique perspective and way that they approach this, and and I had this vision that I was going to neatly put all four of these in a very structured template, if you will, and it was just not easy to do because they all had a very different I don't want to say shelf life, but purpose and focus. And so I just appreciated the fact that everybody sort of did their thing that made most sense for them with the topic that they had. And so I hope that people consume it in that way and aren't looking for any sort of cookie cutter way in which all of these four ideas were presented. So I just appreciated that opportunity. Anybody else before we go on our way? So again, I think everybody has the paper, they have the context that they need, and I hope that in itself is seen as a very powerful thing. Again, I thank you know, certainly the people that did the work to put this paper together. I'm just sort of grateful for the hard work that because this was nobody had extra time to do this, and so we made it very clear that if you're going to be part of this, it wasn't necessarily, it was going to take some effort and work outside, which all of they did. But even just all of you that are here today, and most of you have participated in these conversations, maybe going way back to the spring, and the contributions that you've made and the willingness you've had to come together speaks highly again. My own sort of bragging on the BC, British Columbia education community is indeed a special place and special people, of which you are key members of that. So again, thank you for the privilege of being able to work with all of you on this, because it's just an outstanding learning for me individually. But again, I know there's more work to be done, and I think that's the part I like about this. This is no sort of wrap up. We're done. We have lots more to do with all of these. There's lots of questions that still have left unanswered and probably won't be answered for a while, but that's okay. We're here as learners first, and we're willing to dive in. So thanks everybody. Appreciate all of you, and I wish you well. Have a great, wonderful day, and putting a nice little bow on this crazy, nutty school year. Get yourself a shot if they offer it to you, and next time we see, we'll all be sort of shot up and ready to roll in more just better ways. So thanks everybody. Take care.